Let me start by thanking my beloved colleague, Adam Gregerman, and the woman who I think of as my subway wife, Mary Blaise. I'm fairly certain, and Mary, I think, would concur, that what that subway troubadour saw when he was singing to us was the love that Mary and I share for one another and the affection that we have. I want to thank all of you in this room for honoring me. I'm not known for doing humility, yet here I sit actually feeling humble to find myself in the company of so many outstanding leaders and teachers of Jewish Christian understanding. My personal thanks to each of you who have honored me, and to my distinguished predecessors who have received the Shevet Achim Award before me. I particularly want to focus on the woman sitting in the front row and give my congratulations to Judy Benke, who I think this week got the Tannenbaum Award as well. Judy, you have been an example to all of us of how to do the hard work of interreligious dialogue. If I may, Hine ma tov u'mana'im shevet achim gam yachad. My translation would be, how lovely that we sit together as one family. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the many venues where I've been privileged to increase my own understanding of Jewish-Christian relations, even as I was tasked to teach about them. My work in recent years with the National Council of Synagogues and the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultation, IJKIC, have afforded me many opportunities to work with our Protestant, Catholic, Evangelical, and Christian Orthodox colleagues. And right next to Judy Benke is the former chair of IJKIC, Noam Marins. So I salute you as well, Noam. Over many years, I've had many opportunities to teach at Christian institutions. Since Kevin Spicer so kindly listed them in his gracious introduction, I will not list them once more. I am pointedly, however, not going to talk about my engagements with the Muslim community in the US and worldwide. I'm limiting myself here to Jewish Christian understanding. But most of you in the room know that I have been nudging the CCJR and its constituent members to embrace relations with our Muslim colleagues, inshallah. I am also endlessly grateful to God and my colleagues for the 50 years I have spent at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was ordained, earned my Ph.D., taught for 45 years, and still direct the Finkelstein Institute and the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. Of those 45 years on the JTS faculty, I found myself more and more often referring to those halcyon days of when I was a rabbinical student. I did this so often that a few years ago, my class decided they would do shots every time I said the phrase. It was actually a very happy class that semester. So, l'chaim to all of you who wish to observe that custom, but here I am to tell you, when I was a rabbinical student in the mid-1970s, it became clear to me that my academic path would be in Midrash and Agadah, Talmudic legend. I had the extraordinary privilege of sitting for 7 years in the Talmud class of the late Professor Saul Lieberman, may he rest in peace. In addition to his prodigious memory, Lieberman had written 2 seminal works, Hellenism in Jewish Palestine and Greek in Jewish Palestine. To study seriously with Lieberman, how much the more so to pursue a Ph.D. in rabbinic literature at JTS, I had to learn Greek. Ideally, the Greek of Philo, Josephus, the New Testament, the Church Fathers. How convenient then for me to cross the street and sit in New Testament Greek classes at neighboring Union Theological Seminary, which has been my home, at a second home to JTS since 1976, when I first sat in the New Testament Greek class taught by Professor Marsha Weinstein. It might seem anomalous that a Jewish woman was professor of New Testament Greek, but probably no odder than the marvelous coincidence that when I progressed to take actual New Testament coursework to keep my newly acquired Greek in shape, it was then with a Roman Catholic priest, the late great Father Raymond Brown, who was my rabbi in all things New Testament. Ray became my teacher, my mentor, my rabbi, and my friend. Truthfully, I still miss him every day. So, to do Midrash, I compared the writings of my rabbis of old to the New Testament and, more chronologically comfortably, to the works of the fathers of the church. I learned a little Latin to complement my Greek and was hired in 1980 to teach rabbinics for Christian seminarians at UTS. My experience there, the air I breathed, was that of my MDiv colleagues. I tried to learn to see the world through their eyes. Later, when I worked in medieval midrashim, I did the same with Quran, Hadith, Tafsir, and the like, acquiring just enough Arabic to do so. In my scholarly pursuits then, I had done the hard work of learning the classical texts of Christians and Muslims. When someone first suggested that I attend an ICCJ meeting in Warsaw because I knew ancient texts, I said yes, not realizing that knowing ancient texts did not mean I knew anything of the lived experience of my Christian colleagues. Honestly, I had enough trouble in my ivory tower knowing the lived experience of my Jewish colleagues. Yet what held true of my rabbinic buddies also had weight in the interreligious dialogue world. Having learned their texts and their languages was correctly taken as a sign of my respect for Christianity and Islam. I had the most essential qualification for dialogue. I respected my dialogue partners and their own religions. I was not interested in establishing the primacy of Judaism, but rather learning as much Torah as I could from Christianity and Islam. My topic this afternoon is the mitzvah of interreligious dialogue, and I will devote the remaining 80% of my talk to making a case for this commandment from the Torah, from the rest of the Bible, and from the literature of the rabbis. As I retired this past year from full-time teaching, I welcome the opportunity to give a lecture once again to a captive audience. But do not worry, there won't actually be an exam. On the other hand, the test of today's lecture is the extent to which we all, Jews and Christians alike, rededicate ourselves to dialogue. In order to set the stage for my proposition, some history of interreligious dialogue is in order. So please bear with me while I survey the relevant landmarks in history that led us to being here together today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, I did promise you a historical survey, so where else did you want me to start? In truth, we can skip over the events of the first six days of creation and zero in on day 6, the first 5 days of creation, and we'll zero in on day 6, for on that day, God created humanity in the form of Adam, or as our colleague Phyllis Tribble felicitously translates, earth person. In the beginning, Adam and Eve were inseparable. Adam had Eve's back and she had his, literally. They were, in the words of the early 5th century rabbinic midrashic commentary, Genesis Rabbah, they were androgynous. They were diprosopon, two-faced. For history to unfold, God needed to perform a little bit of surgery, separating them from one another into two distinct sentient creatures, each made in the image of their creator. It will be made clear by the rabbis how significant this creation was. The one God, of necessity, creating but one human, admittedly with two sides, in God's image and likeness. Theologically, this is satisfying, but it still begs the question of why God did not choose to make two separate men and women at one fell swoop, or why God chose not to have humanity descend, say, from apes. One God, one human. Our relationship with our fellow humans was and remains mediated through our relationship with our Creator. This requires that we recognize the divine reflection of our fellow humans and honor it and love it. One of the earliest rabbinic texts sweetly dilates on this notion when it teaches, quote, "It was an act of affection that God created humanity in God's image and likeness. And it was an act of even greater affection that God revealed to humanity that we are created in God's image and likeness." Seeing the godly in our fellow human beings is admittedly often a challenge, but on occasion, it's numinously clear. Some folks lord it over others. They pretend to be holier than thou. But others, as we know, walk humbly with their God. For most of us, we need to be reminded that we're all equal in the eyes of our Creator, and that none of us is better than any other. No person, no tribe, no nation, no religion. In the late 2nd century, the rabbis explicitly taught, quote, "Humanity was created as a single individual for the sake of peace, that none may say to his or her fellow, 'My ancestor was greater than your ancestor.'" The rabbis assert this claim in the wake of their reading of the creation narrative, to be sure, but they also find further relevance to this claim in another famous narrative of Genesis, this one about the eponymous ancestor of the Jews, Jacob, who is Israel. Regarding Jacob, the biblical narrative explicitly celebrates the divinity in humanity. When Jacob returned home after 20 years in exile, he was fearful of seeing his brother, whom he still regarded as his enemy. He had treated Esau badly as a youth, cheating him out of his birthright and his father's blessing. Yet, while Jacob was in fearful exile, Esau waxed mighty and apparently grew emotionally as well. Jacob sought to propitiate his brother by bringing him gifts which were meant perhaps to atone for Jacob's feelings of guilt at how he had treated his brother. Or perhaps the wagon train of gifts was a form of bribery for Esau's affection. Yet when Esau finally once again beheld his long-lost brother, he, quote, "ran to greet him. He embraced him. He hugged him. He kissed him. And they wept." Jacob still implored him to take the gift. But Esau demurred, saying, "I have plenty." Jacob's response to his brother is an insightful commentary on the creation story earlier in Genesis. He tells the man he thought to be his enemy, quote, "Accept from me this gift, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God." This is the moment in which the father of the Jewish people, Jacob's relationship to God, is reflected in his relationship to his alienated brother. It is a guiding star of how we must behave towards others, towards capital O, others. Would that we could each overcome our guilt feelings and our fears and see the face of God as we behold someone else. In truth, I confess I'm not always up to the task that Father Jacob set for us. I feel fairly certain that when I gaze at the face of Vladimir Putin, I see only evil. Failing to see the godly in Putin might perhaps be a virtue. It's more mundane failures to acknowledge the divine in others that actually challenge us. In the Talmud tractate Sukkah, we read, Shimon ben Yochai said, "I have seen the sons of heaven, and they are but few. If there be 1,000, I and my son are among them. If 100, I and my son are among them. And if only 2, they are I and my son." The medieval Talmudic commentator Rashi explains that these sons of heaven are they who behold God's very presence. Now, in Talmudic storytelling, no one ever accuses Shimon ben Yochai of humility. Shimon and his son serve as negative paradigms for what can go wrong when one has learned much, yet nevertheless fails to relate to those around him. The stories about these two rabbis promote the virtues of humility and use their arrogance as a pedagogical tool to teach proper comportment towards God's creatures, fellow humans. Here's a story about Shimon's son Elazar, who in the rabbi's narrative world shares his father's arrogance and disdain. Once upon a time, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, was coming from his master's school in Migdal Gdor, riding his donkey along the riverside. He was arrogantly pleased with himself that he had learned so much Torah. He chanced across a man who appeared to him exceedingly ugly. The man said, "Shalom to you, my rabbi." But Rabbi Elazar did not return his greeting. Instead, Elazar said to him, "Reka, worthless one, how ugly are you? Are all the citizens of your town as ugly as you are?" The man replied, "I do not know. But go tell the artisan who made me, what an ugly vessel you have made." When Rabbi Elazar realized he had sinned, he got down from his donkey and prostrated himself before the man and apologized. "I have insulted you, please forgive me." But the man demurred, saying, "I will not forgive you until you go and tell the artisan who made me, what an ugly vessel you have made." That man followed Rabbi Elazar until he reached his own town, whereupon all the folk of the town came out to greet their rabbi. They said to him, "Shalom to you, our rabbi, our teacher, our teacher." And the man asked, "Whom do you call Rabbi, Rabbi?" They replied, "To the man that follows you." He startlingly said, "If this is your rabbi, may there not be others like him among the Jewish people." They asked, "Why do you say that?" And he related to them what Elazar had done to him. They implored him, "Nevertheless, forgive him, for he is a great man of Torah." And that man said, "For your sake, I forgive him, so long as he does not keep doing this." Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, immediately entered the academy and expounded, "One should always be as gentle as the reed and not as hard as the cedar. This is why the reed has the merit to have a pen made from it, with which we write a Torah, tefillin, and mezuzahs." That story is in the Babylonian Talmud, Tani 20a and b. Rabbi Elazar was so proud of himself. Alas, he learned all that Torah and apparently missed the whole point. I'm taken by the fact that the Talmud understands the dangers of arrogance, and especially the fact that learning cannot replace proper behavior. Human decency is the goal of God's instruction, as the medieval rabbis so regularly form it, derech eretz kadma Torah. Decency takes precedence over Torah. The Babylonian Talmud looks back on this tale of an ancient Palestinian rabbi from a perceptive distance. The Talmud demands that an arrogant rabbi understand what it means to be seen as the ugly other. The man is described as exceedingly ugly. And yet at the same time, that man knows his self-worth. He is created by God, the same as Rabbi Elazar, in the very image and likeness of the Creator. How clever of the Talmudic narrator to see both the point of view of the rabbi as well as that of his antagonist. Why does the Talmud describe Elazar in such a negative fashion? Here's the lesson they want us to learn by beginning their telling of the tale from Elazar's point of view. Every human being has worth. Yet humans, us, when too puffed up by our own worth, We may demean others. We humans have an unfortunate tendency to raise ourselves at the expense of others. We see them as ugly, not like us. Indeed, we all have too strong a tendency to see those not like us as ugly. We humiliate others. We demonize the other. That ugly man in our story must be understood as anyone, any person we debase. They may not be of our same race. They may not be of the same country. They may simply attend a different synagogue, church, or mosque, or more on topic, they may not share the same religion. We're so very good in our pride and arrogance at seeing others who are not like us as being exceedingly ugly. And so we're caught short when we're reminded that every human being shares the same worth. Each individual was created by the same artisan, indeed in the very image and likeness of the divine creator. And this is true no matter how one worships the creator. All of us, every one of us, no matter what religious path we follow, are vessels fashioned by the same divine artisan. All of us merit recognition of our relationship with God. Many years ago, I had the privilege of dining at the Shabbat table of our teacher, Rabbi Jacob Milgrom. May he rest in peace. Many of you might know Rabbi Milgrom as the scholar who wrote an Anchor Bible commentary on the book of Leviticus. I learned a different lesson at Jack Milgrom's table in Jerusalem. For when he sang Friday Night Kiddush, he altered one word. Instead of chanting Asher Bachar Banu Mi Kol Ha'amim, a prayer thanking God for choosing us from among all the nations, Jack sang Asher Bachar Banu Im Kol Ha'amim, thanking God for choosing us along with all the other nations. From me to Im, a simple reversal that yields an entirely different theological worldview. This is the worldview that I am offering today as a mitzvah. The commandment in Leviticus chapter 19, love your neighbor as yourself. Not surprisingly, Jack Milgrom has led us back to Leviticus. Yet the command to love our neighbor possibly has a soft underbelly of narrow particularism. Let's remember that Leviticus is a book famously distinguishes between us versus them, priest versus Israelite, Jew versus Gentile, men versus women, gay versus straight, clean versus unclean. At best, this is tough love, but at worst, we're looking at bold prejudice and ugly Jewish chauvinism. The earliest rabbinic commentary, the Sifra, on the passage starkly states, be holy means be separate. Alas, we could fairly characterize the commandment to love your neighbor within its context as teaching particularism. Love your Jewish neighbor as yourself. Indeed, some of the commentaries on that verse say, your neighbor as yourself literally means the neighbor who is most like you, the Jew. Maybe worse, one commentary suggests you should love your neighbor until he becomes a member of the covenant, just like you. Part of me is deeply offended and put off by this kind of excruciating exclusivism. But another part of me confesses that if we read the biblical command in its entirety, the verse in Leviticus 19:18 says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your kinsfolk. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Is it possible? Is it possible that loving your neighbor extends no further than to your kinsfolk, your clan, your tribe? I want to resist the narrow reading of particularism that I've uncovered. So I ask myself, is there a universalist, outward-looking reading of love your neighbor as yourself in Jewish tradition? I'm happy and relieved to say there is. In a medieval compilation known as a minor tractate of the Talmud, Kala Rabati, we find the interpretation of that commandment as follows. By loving your neighbor, you come to see the way he is like you. This is most welcome, for it emphasizes exactly the recognition of our common humanity that we are seeking. But still, given my earlier exploration of the narrow reading of Jewish tradition, I yet ask why one would read so generously, especially given the fuller context of the verse I quoted and the fact that many commentators read that as only referring to Jews. But I think here, the broader context of Leviticus 19 comes to the rescue. Towards the end of that chapter, we read, quote, "When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, God, am your Lord." And universalist love of the other is not simply limited to Leviticus 19:34. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites are commanded in an even stronger fashion. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall help him to lift it up. That's Exodus 23, verses 4 and 5. This is more than just loving the stranger or recognizing common humanity. The Exodus commandment requires compassion for your enemy, the one who hates you. Well, at least for that person's animal. But surely the commandment must apply to the human being as well as the animal, doesn't it? Well, let's be reassured by the biblical book of Proverbs, which makes clear it's not just the donkey, it's the enemy for whom we are commanded. Proverbs 25 says, "If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he's thirsty, give him water to drink." So, I've just mentioned Israel's enemy and his donkey, and that, of course, leads me to think of Balaam and his donkey, the narrative in Numbers 22-24, where we read of King Balak's desire to harm the Jews. He hires Balaam ben Beor to curse the people of Israel. In the end, of course, we know the story. God prevails. And on Friday nights, in many synagogues, we still sing out loud Balaam's blessing. Ma tovu ohalecha. We won't sing around. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. I want to point out that Balaam ben Beor, is the quintessential interreligious dialoguer, from whom we learn the possibility of transforming hate and curses into love and liturgy, with God's help, of course, and the best of intentions. Ma tovu ohalecha is the ultimate good result for interreligious dialogue. A medieval Midrash, Seder Eliyahu Rabbah, teaches as follows. I'm quoting, "There was no matter whatsoever that the Blessed Holy One did not reveal to Balaam. Balaam ben Beor was even greater in wisdom than Moses." Say what? Greater in wisdom than Moses? This Midrash is astonishing and humbling. It reminds me, as a rabbi, that God speaks to non-Jews as well as to Jews. It reminds us that there's wisdom to be learned from our interfaith interlocutors, even religious wisdom, God's revelation. There are indeed prophets who are not Jews. Now, I want to acknowledge some of my scholarly colleagues have interpreted certain of the rabbinic midrashim about Balaam as referring to Jesus. Others suggest that Midrash Seder Eliyahu, composed in its final form in the 9th, 10th century under Islamic rule, is thinking of the preeminent non-Jewish prophet of his time, Muhammad. Could one then not reasonably say, there is no God but God, and Balaam or Muhammad is God's prophet? Articulating such a statement does not make me a Muslim, nor would a similar statement about Jesus make me a Christian. But it does make me a Jewish monotheist who recognizes, as the Bible and centuries of rabbis before me, that there are prophets of God, who speak God's word among all nations and all religions. I want to return to Leviticus 19. That passage famously, gloriously spells out the requirements of loving compassion for our fellow humans. In particular, Jews are commanded to care for others less well off in the community. The assumption, I think, is that God is the creator of the world, so everything belongs to God. As the psalmist puts it in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord and all that's in it. This helps us understand the sweeping redistribution of wealth commanded in Leviticus 19. The Torah requires Jews at harvest time to leave the corners of their field, any dropped or fallen produce, even the forgotten harvest, for the poor to glean. It belongs to God, not to the farmer. So God can command the farmer to give what is God's to another of God's creatures. The rabbis, even as they understood a particularist application of this commandment as being about Jews and their relationship to other Jews, radically qualified this commandment by also requiring, and I'm quoting the Mishnah now, if the non-Jewish poor wish to partake of that boon, we do not withhold it in the interests of peace. This is a fabulous recognition that Jews do not live in isolation. We are all dependent on one another. And as such, the rabbis insist on sharing this boon with all poor. In the interest of peace with our neighbors, the rabbis go so far as to say that in a city that had both Jewish and Gentile populations, which is to say, of course, most cities, quote, the rabbinic charity officers would collect from and distribute to their non-Jewish neighbors alongside the Jews in the interest of peace. That's the Tosefta Giti. The command to compassion went beyond the elementary or the monetary. The rabbis note, quote, one would bury non-Jewish dead and mourn them and offer condolence to their families in the interests of peace. So too, one must visit the sick among non-Jews and dower their brides. Even the simplest of exchanges was regulated by this loving sensibility, as Jews are enjoined to acknowledge their non-Jewish neighbors with a common Jewish greeting, shalom, in the interests of peace. And the Tosefta in Avodah Zarah says that we even extend those greetings for Gentile religious holidays. I suppose it's appropriate for me to say Happy Diwali. We are commanded in the interests of peace and more to engage in dialogue with our neighbors. When a non-Jew famously asked Hillel the elder to teach him the Torah while standing on one foot, Hillel taught, what is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. Or to state it positively, biblically, love your neighbor as yourself. Friends, this is the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. Our religious sensibility constantly requires us to reflect on God and our relationship to our Creator. Our relationship with our fellow human is mediated through our relationship with God. In Judaism, indeed, our relationship to our fellow humans is dictated by our covenantal relationship to God, who commands the very details of those relationships. We're not required to always agree with our neighbors, or even necessarily to like them. But we are commanded to love our neighbors. When we engage in dialogue, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean that I am commanded to love my neighbor? What do we hope to accomplish? Under certain circumstances of interreligious dialogue, we will be firefighting, if you will, struggling for our right to exist, or even be part of a conversation. Yet, in other circumstances, we will be tree planting, carefully tending the garden of dialogue for those who come after us. My own Archbishop in New York City, Timothy Cardinal Dolan, explained that there is in fact more than one kind of dialogue. He has called for an end to what he characterized as, quote, a dialogue of grievance. We cannot allow our dialogue to be a litany of kvetch, kvetch, kvetch. And thank God, this is not usually necessary any longer. Instead, my friend Cardinal Dolan suggests that it's time to roll up our sleeves and together tackle the many problems that face our society: poverty, hunger, homelessness. The list goes on and on. It is time for a dialogue of love. Let us do so in the interests of peace. Doing so in alliance together makes us stronger and makes the burden lighter. Let us dialogue and then together do those things that God asks of us. Let us love our neighbors as we love ourselves. It's a mitzvah. Thank you.